I really appreciate the invitation to come and be a part. And I want to say something to the congregation here, a word of gratitude for all of the work that has gone into putting something like this together. It is a mammoth undertaking. It is not just financial, but it's the time and the energy to orchestrate and to make all of the arrangements that can cause this to be possible. And so, very grateful to you for that. It's also been very enjoyable to get to meet brethren or see brethren from across the country. I don't always get to spend time with like I would like to do. Having worked as described in a number of ways, a number of years, things like this also give me a chance to meet former students and then meet their children, right? And nothing makes you feel like, hey, the years are passing when you meet their children and they're growing up and doing their thing. But it's always a real pleasure because the Lord's church is a very, very special family. When I meet others, you know, the children of friends and former students and things, I'm always trying to remember the names and keep them straight. But it caused me to realize for a moment that we do spend a great deal of time thinking about the names that we give to our children, or what they mean, if anything in particular, to us or to our loved ones. I want to begin this afternoon by just acknowledging for a moment that the same thing is true, especially in the Old Testament, maybe even to a higher degree. Names in the Old Testament can very often mean something significant. For example, even the name Malachi, my messenger, God used this prophet to speak to his people. Significant names for Hosea and his wife as they begin to have their children. In Isaiah chapter 8, Meher Shalal Hashbaz, right, this name that Isaiah gave to his son, suggested the conquest that was going to come to Syria and Ephraim. And so I'm not necessarily surprised to realize that even Isaiah, his name has a very special meaning because it means Yahweh is salvation. I know that there were qualifications that Isaiah had that caused God to use him in this particular capacity. But I also find it noteworthy that the name that Isaiah bears is very much tied to the central theme of this entire book. For with all of its rich themes and the tremendous vocabulary that's found there, it's been often said that the key word of the book of Isaiah is the word salvation. It's found 26 times in these 66 verses, and that may not seem like a high density or a high frequency until you stop and count. It's only used 7 times in all the other prophetic books combined. So what is it that's on God's mind as he inspires Isaiah to do this sweeping breadth of work? And without doubt, it is the word salvation that is on his mind. Isaiah is used by God as a part of predictive prophecy. That is, the Lord knows things that are going to happen centuries to come, not just speaking to the days of Isaiah. That means it's been rightly said that when the prophets of old would speak, they weren't just speaking about future people, but in their message, they could also be speaking to future people, to encourage, to correct, to promote, to build excitement and hope. And Isaiah does all of those things as well. He speaks to his own day, and to be honest with you, he speaks to ours as well, as a part of the Christian age. Isaiah has a broad vision as a book, not surprising with 66 chapters of material, but he pictures humanity in its needs. We cope with sin, wrongdoing, and problems, and so we have issues with one another and with our Creator. So Isaiah also in this sweeping vision will talk about God's plans for rescue based upon humanity's needs. And to do that, it takes a long vision peering into the future. Rescue missions. Whenever we hear about an earthquake, buildings collapsing, there are wildfires, or there's flooding, we're not surprised to hear there are people who rush out and engage in rescue efforts. And we're very grateful for their efforts, and they're perhaps even risking their own lives, right? Have you ever stopped to think about the Christian story and our part in it by describing it as a rescue mission, where this being, a part of the Godhead, sees the need that humanity has and says, I can help with that, Rick's language, and come and perform what is, in effect, a rescue mission. Because that's what this book is about as well as the entirety of this thread that runs through God's book. So when we look at the book of Isaiah today in this session, we're talking about chapters 49 through 57. That's an important section because salvation as a key theme or word is at the heart of that set of chapters. It's been said that there are 5 different servant poems that are found in this book, in the latter portions, chapters 40 through 66. They all have to do with Jesus, all 5. They talk about him and his mission and the aspects of what he's done and in Isaiah's day would come to do. But in our section, 49 through 57, 3 of those 5 poems about Jesus are found. God is concerned with salvation. We always have to read texts in context, and so as we narrow from the book down to the second portion of the book, chapters 40 through 66, we need to see it in the context in which it's placed. In the prior 2 chapters, 38 and 39, we are told that King Hezekiah, in the 7 centuries before Jesus, had welcomed these envoys from Babylon, brought them in, and began to show them the treasures. And in chapter 39, Isaiah speaks to the king and said, you know, those visitors that you showed around, they are going to be so impressed with what they saw, why they're going to want to come back. And they do come back. It's in the year 606 as a part of the Babylonian conquest under Nebuchadnezzar. Well, that's what Isaiah is envisioning down the road. But chapter 40 begins after that has taken place. Those visitors come back, there is conquest. The people of Judah and Jerusalem are carried away in the main to Babylonian captivity. This rest of the book is a message for those exiles. But not only for those exiles. It is also a message that is tied to the messianic work, the salvific work of Jesus, the Christ. And as a result, it is a message that pertains to every single person who wants to be a part of God's great family and take advantage of Jesus' rescue efforts. Now, what we're doing is we're narrowing down little by little till we finally end up with our 9 chapters. But in chapters 40 through 66, there is usually a couple of different breakdowns the way this material is seen to work together. Most commentators would look and say chapters 40 through 48 commonly see those together. But then there are 2 groups of viewpoints, I guess I should say, looking at the rest of the material from 49 to 55 and then 56 to 66. Or would it be better to divide it 49 to 57 and then 58 to 66? To a degree, we're imposing these artificial divisions, and we might ask, is there really a need to worry, or how would we make this discernment? But I would argue that there is something very distinct to point to that says that we make the division up to 49 to 57. And here is what it is that stands out. If you go to the end of chapter 48, the end of that first 9 chapters, 40 through 48, the last words is, there is no peace, says the Lord, for the wicked. And then curiously, when you go to the end of chapter 57, the end of the next 9 chapters, it is almost exactly a repeat. The content, in fact, is a repeat. The attribution is a synonymous description. There is no peace, says my God, for the wicked. And so those are seen as the seams, the transition points. So there are 9 chapters in the first part of our section, 9 chapters in the middle, which we are focusing on, and then 9 chapters at the end. We're going to focus, as we said here, on these sections about Isaiah 49 through 57. Routinely, Bible students and commentators have looked and said there are 5 distinct sections that we can identify here, and here they are for you to take note of. And what we're going to do is walk through each of these 5 and make sense out of what that section, each of those sections, is intended to convey. Okay? So the first one is a servant commissioned, 49:1 through chapter 50 and verse number 9. We could alternately title this A Servant Who is Encouraging. As we go to the next section, you'll see, because this section begins with a servant. That servant is Jesus. And he's speaking about both his mission and the confidence and commitment he has to finish it. The very first section of this is our second servant poem out of the 5 that are contained in the last half of Isaiah. This second one expresses the servant's mission in verses 1 through 13. I hope you have your Bible. We'll not read every verse throughout, of course, but there are some key places we can make note of. And one of them, first of all, is found in chapter 49 in verse number 3. This is that servant who is found to be Jesus. And he says, "He, that is the Lord, said to me, you are my servant, Israel, in whom I will be glorified." And then if you look down just a little bit farther in verse number 8, you'll notice the reference to a covenant. "Thus says the Lord, in a time of favor, I have answered you. In the day of salvation, I've helped you. I will keep you and give you as a covenant to the people, to establish the land and to apportion the desolate heritages." And we pause. If someone were reading this section, they might think that God is, in verse 3, addressing the nation. And he is not. If we go back to the name of the nation, they get their name, Israel, from Jacob, who back in the book of Genesis has his name changed by God. And it's his family that grows to be so large, his dozen sons, his one daughter, all of his grandchildren, and on, they comprise the nation of Israel. Now, I know the Lord made promises about a nation to Abraham and Sarah in the long past, but we don't see their children being so large in number or scope. It's Israel. So if we were to speak about Jacob, we could say Israel, oh, he's the father of this nation. But what about now if that term is applied to Jesus? Wouldn't it be fair, knowing the Bible's teachings as we do, that Jesus be described as the father of a new nation, this time not bound by blood, that is their own blood, but bound by his blood shed on our behalf? And in verse number 8, the Bible does not say, God speaks to the servant, and I'll make a covenant with you. What he says is, I will make you as a covenant to involve all of these other people. That is a foreshadowing of what Christ will do in giving himself to establish that new covenant spoken of in Hebrews chapter 9. So when the servant speaks about his mission, he already is pictured here as recognizing not only his commission, but what God intends to do through him. Now, the reason that's important is if you go to the next verse, number 14 in chapter 49, Zion, the people of Israel, the Jews have said, the Lord has forsaken me, my Lord has forgotten me. These are people who through captivity have wondered, have we been abandoned? Are we subject to these foreign invaders because God doesn't care about us anymore? This middle section is important because beginning in verse 15, God speaks and he says, it couldn't be farther from the truth. In verse 15, can a woman forget her nursing child, that she would have no compassion on the son of her womb? Even these may forget, yet I will not forget you. Behold, I've engraved you on the palms of my hands. Your walls are continually before me. Now, you can read farther, but the gist of this is the Lord looks and says, I have not forgotten you. Their sins have caused them some problems. There have been repercussions they've had to endure. But here is God always wanting them to thrive. And when they are ready and things have been put back into place appropriately, here is God who is rescuing them. He's concerned about them. And I have 3 children and 2 grandchildren. Yay. Punishment is never pleasant to have to administer. I mean, no parent who's any good at their job looks at it and thinks, yippee, I get to punish. But we know that it has value to hold people accountable and to train littles to become bigs who know boundaries and right and wrong. And God is no different in that regard. We do it as an unpleasant necessity born out of love for this other person. This is one of the most tender, compassionate sections in all of Isaiah, where God speaks and says, what you've had to go through was by necessity because of the things that you've done that are wrong. But the Father, their God, loves them and wants to bring them back when they've had this addressed appropriately, when they become aware of what they've been doing wrong and are willing to make a change. Here is God presented as compassionate. So in their despondency, this section is meant to encourage or raise them up. In the last section of this part, verses 54 through 9. This is that third servant poem of the 5 we've talked about in the latter half of Isaiah. And in this one, here is the servant saying that he is willing to be serving, he's the ideal servant, and he's not going to stop on his mission no matter the opposition. You could read verses 4 and 5. And he talks about how God has something to say, and he is there to learn it and to be a great student of the Most High. You could look in verses 7 through 9, and he says, I'm going to be vindicated, I'm not going to give up. But you look in the middle, in verse number 6, he is even willing to endure abuse and mistreatment to fulfill this rescue mission. So this is the end of this section where the people are meant to be lifted up and encouraged. There are great things that are coming. Don't give up on God, but see the bigger picture and be a part of a great success story. Our next section, chapter 50, verse 10 through 52:12. This is a nation encouraged, and it really does represent a shift from the past section. In the past section, if there was a nation that was despondent or discouraged, and the servant speaks and says, no, see the bigger picture, now we see a people who are lifted up. As a result, they are looking to the future, the closer future, and the Messianic age as well. That servant's confidence has become theirs as well. Notice with me in chapter 51, verses 1 and 2, where we see these people exhorted. And we have a mention here of Abraham and Sarah. Listen to me, you who pursue righteousness, you who seek the Lord. Look to the rock from which you were hewn, and to the quarry from which you were dug. Look to Abraham, your father, and to Sarah who bore you. For he was but one when I called him, that I might bless him and multiply him. I'm sure the remnants could look around and think that on the world stage they are a minority. They're a sliver. They might look and say so many of their own have been lost in whatever way. They are just a remnant, truly a remnant. But God is attempting to encourage them to think for just a moment that their entire national and family history began with one man and one woman. Not Adam and Eve, but Abraham and Sarah. They didn't know where they were going. They're traveling as a small group in the midst of the wider world, but where they went, God directed. What they did, God blessed. And he asked them to have the same type of confidence or spirit here as well. When you get to the middle section, they are summoned, they're called forth. Beginning in verse number 9 of this chapter, there are 3 pairs of double imperatives. 3 pairs of double imperatives. The first one you'll notice in verse number 9. This is the writer, the author, Isaiah, writing to the Lord, and he says, awake, awake, and put on strength, O arm of the Lord. Awake as in the days of old, the generations of long ago. Was it not you who cut Rahab, which is a reference not to the woman, but to Egypt? Was it not you who cut Rahab in pieces, who pierced the dragon? Was it not you who dried up the sea and the waters of the great deep, who made the depths of the sea a way for the redeemed to pass over? This is Isaiah calling out to the Lord and saying, will you bring your might to bear now for your people? We're thinking the exiles coming out of captivity. But he's also flexing the same muscles. Our God is so big, so strong, and so mighty that he can affect the Messianic age as well. If you look forward to verse 17, there is this second set of double imperatives. 17, wake yourself, and stand up, O Jerusalem, you who've drunk from the hand of the Lord the cup of his wrath, who have drunk to the dregs the bowl, the cup of staggering. This is God asking Israel, Zion, his people, to wake up and realize what they've suffered was deserved by faithlessness. They've tied themselves to the wrong people, the wrong alleged saviors or deliverers, but they've learned that really it's God to whom they should be tied. He's asking them to wake up. The breach was never on his part, but he is willing to use his power on their behalf. But they need to wake up and want it. The third set of double imperatives at the beginning of 52. Awake and awake, put on your strength, O Zion. Put on your beautiful garments, O Jerusalem, the holy city, for there shall no more come into you the uncircumcised and the unclean, the invaders. Shake yourself from the dust and arise and be seated, O Jerusalem. Loose the bonds of your neck, O captive daughter of Zion. Put on your good clothes. Be able to celebrate. You're no longer slaves under someone else's dominion. You're my redeemed people, and he's rescued them. This is a picture of celebration. The punishment, as it says, is over. That's why this section focuses upon good news. Notice in verse number 7, it probably will sound familiar to some. How beautiful upon the mountains are the feet of him who brings good news, who publishes peace, who brings good news of happiness, who publishes salvation, and who says to Zion, your God reigns. That is such an impressive statement. It applies not only to the exiles who ended up coming home because God knew that Cyrus appointed to would allow it, but it also speaks to the Christian age. That's why Paul quotes it in Romans chapter 10. The good news to the captives to come home to Jerusalem, to be reconciled with God, was a foreshadowing of the larger summons or invitation or opportunity of good news for the entire human race to come home and to be reconciled to God. This is a section meant to encourage people to look forward, a nation encouraged. Now, what does it take to make that possible? And the answer is the third section, that there has to be this suffering servant who's come and made that rescue effective. This is the fourth of the great poems, the servant poems. The fifth one is in the next major section. But 2, 3, and 4 are here, and this is the fourth one, sometimes considered the greatest. It might be familiar to you from partaking in the Lord's Supper or other studies and lessons. This is what's necessary, chapter 53, to make the reconciliation spoken of possible. 52 verse 7 can't, in the ultimate sense, take place unless chapter 53 also occurs. Here is the servant offering himself. In verses 13 through 15, the first of the 5 small 3-verse paragraphs here, it is a summary of what the rest of this chapter poem will be about. And it's about Christ and his suffering. You have his humble circumstances of beginning in chapter 53, 1 through 3. You have the abuses that will lead to execution in the heart of the chapter. And then it concludes in verses 10 through 12 with a celebration that this suffering servant, he's not been removed, he's not been made ineffective. He's accomplished exactly the rescue mission for which he came, and now he's being exalted and honored as he ought to be. In my mind, when I read this, I connect it back to the book of Philippians, chapter 2, verses 5 through 8, and then 9 through 11. In Philippians chapter 2, Paul begins by saying, let this mind be in you, which is also in Christ Jesus, who, being in the form of God, thought it not robbery to be equal with God. Pause. The simple statement is that the Word, God the Word, before becoming flesh, God the Word is ensconced in heaven as a part of the Godhead. When Isaiah saw that throne room scene in Isaiah chapter 6, God the Word is a part of the Godhead situated on a throne. But God the Word condescended to be found in fashion as a man. That's John 1 and verse 14. And so in verses 7 and 8 of Philippians 2, he emptied himself by taking upon himself the form of a servant and coming in the likeness of men. Verse 8, and being found in fashion as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient up to the point of death, even the death of the cross. I've always been amazed by that section and how it encapsulates the significance of Jesus' life in ways that maybe I hadn't prior recognized. You could take verse 8 at the beginning and you can translate the participles there and say, since he was found in fashion as a man, he, and the rest of the verse. I've always thought of Ecclesiastes 12, verses 13 and 14 tied to that section. What is it that I'm asked to do as a human being? Male or female, doesn't matter, a human being. What is it my Creator would ask of me and all of my fellow human beings? Solomon summarized it and said that we are to fear God and to keep his commandments. This is the whole of man duty. I tend to remove that, number one, because it's not there, but also because I think that it begins to limit, in my mind, the scope. The whole of your existence, the whole of mine, is to fear God and keep his commandments. That's my reason for being. It'll play out in a variety of different ways, no doubt about that. Your life is yours, my life is mine, but I can live it in service to my God. But isn't that what Philippians chapter 2, verse 7 and then verse 8 says? Since Jesus was found in fashion as a man, he did the things that human beings ought to do, which is to be submissive and obedient and not know an end of that. Oh God, you're asking too much. No, really not. I could never be faithful under those type of opposition circumstances. Oh, but we can be faithful. All the way to the point of death. That's what this section takes us to up in verse number 9, up to verse number 9. Well, back in Philippians chapter 2, verses 9 through 11, wherefore God has highly exalted him, given him a name above every name. At his name, every knee should bow and every tongue should confess. That's the exaltation that it should be received by the Christ, by Jesus who engaged in the rescue mission. That's what verses 10 through 12 speak about. I'm sorry, I'm pointing to the screen that I'm looking at. You're looking at the same thing. That's what that section talks about. That Christ has been exalted appropriately because he carried through on salvation's plan. And we get to rejoice because something wonderful has come down to us. The next section, promises to the faithful. In this section, it's really read on the heels of what do we do with what we've just learned, right? This is the consequence of the prior section. When you read it, you see celebration, not sadness. We see joy, not grief. And all of it is made true, or possible at least, because of chapter number 53. The servant has done what he ought to do. Look with me, if you will, in chapter 54, verses 1, 2, and 3. Sing, O barren one who did not bear, break forth into singing and cry aloud, you who have not been in labor. For the children of the desolate one will be more than the children of her who is married, says the Lord. Enlarge the place of your tent. Let the curtains of your habitations be stretched out. Do not hold back. Lengthen your cords and strengthen your stakes. For you will spread abroad to the right and to the left. Your offspring will possess the nations and will people the desolate cities. You know, when I read about the Israelites or the Jews coming back from Babylonian captivity, they had sometimes to face conflict from those who opposed them. But they did not go on a worldwide campaign for conquest. While there's a promise here of prosperity coming in and being stable, this is messianic. The gospel kingdom is spreading, as Daniel would see in Daniel chapter 2. There's more and more space needed. Why? Because there are more and more people who are a part of this wonderful nation that can celebrate being a part of God's people. And as you read through, they're encouraged, but I want to note chapter 55, verses 6 through 13, a pardoned people. Summarizing, the writer simply points out that only the pardoned can take part. God is taught. He certainly has a means of redemption, but it requires my participation, your participation, and anyone else's. That we would be willing to act upon God's graciousness and goodness and make that opportunity become a reality for us. And that's the encouragement that's found here. One quick note. I mentioned at the very beginning that sometimes people divide this section, this latter part of Isaiah, where it goes from 49 up to 55. And then 56 goes on in a new section to 66 in closing out the book. We've already said we've got a repeated refrain that proposes an alternate structure. But one of the reasons why people propose that is because of that last entry, a serving people. When you read it, it has an ethical component. He encourages them to uphold righteousness, to observe the Sabbath, to do all of the things that for the Jews would have been contained in the law of Moses. But all he's saying is live the faith. And when you come to the next section, our major section, the warnings to the wicked, some commentators or reviewers will say, well, that certainly doesn't belong with chapter 53, does it? But I would argue that it does. Not just because 57:21 has that repeated refrain, but because in chapter 56, the closing parts, there is an encouragement to live righteously. In chapter 57, there is an encouragement to put away evil. And Isaiah has switched gears a little bit. He's no longer speaking significantly or primarily to the Messianic age, or even to the age of the exiles from Babylon coming home. They're certainly included. But Isaiah is a man who lives in a community. He knows people. He interacts with. He sees the good and the bad that people engage in. A prophet speaks on behalf of God, both to their own circumstances as well as to things in the future. Yes. Here is Isaiah speaking to his own people. They had a chance to turn things around in their lives. They had a chance to take advantage of God's grace. Long before there was the Babylonian captivity, long before Jesus came, they could still choose to be righteous, and the blood of Christ, that suffering servant, would cover all that was needed. So this is a petition, the end of 56, the beginning of 57. Let's do things that are right. Maybe we should phrase it, let's start doing things that are right. Let's stop doing the things that are immoral, unethical, unrighteous. They are not worthy of God and his creation. I notice here that he speaks about the leaders. They've not been doing what is right. The ways that people are living are immoral, unacceptable. They have problems with behavior one towards another, fairness, equity, justice, goodness. Those things are so often lacking in his own time. I read about those things and I thought to myself, well, there's a failure of leadership, there's a failure among the people as well. And here's the reality. I say this as a resident of the 21st century America, right? The reality is that when people forget God, they introduce problems of all sorts into their lives. It isn't just a spiritual breakdown. It becomes a social breakdown. There is an ethical breakdown, even when I consider just a secular viewpoint. People lie, they cheat, they steal. Why? Because they have no compass based upon their relationship with God. A spiritual breakdown leads to problems in all aspects of life. And if you'd like to see that described in detail, look at the end of the book of Judges. In Judges, after that middle section detailing all of the individual judges, the circumstances, the risings and the fallings, chapters 17 through 21 is an epilogue or closing section to the book. It is interesting to me that closing section begins with the words of Judges 17, verse 6. In those days, there was no king in Israel, and every man did that which was right in his own eyes. I call my shots. No one's going to tell me what to do. Don't tread on me. And so that epilogue describes the problems. At the beginning of chapter 18, there is a repetition or recitation of that. There was no king. That's why these problems are happening. And then you watch the butchery, the immorality, the heinous activities of the figures that are in the latter chapters of Judges. And I'm not surprised that in chapter 21, verse 25, it is that refrain one more time as a summative statement. Why would all of these horrible things happen, even among God's people? And the answer is, they're not living as God's people. When we forget to be who God calls us to be, we suffer in every facet of life. And in those days, there was no king in Israel, and every man did that which was right in his own eyes. That's an explanation of the book of Judges. So the writer here is encouraging them, don't make that your reality. There is the one positive statement here in the wicked in hope, verses 14 through 19. It's the only positive statement in the entire chapter, where he speaks about the fact that if they'll change the way the prophet is encouraging, everything can be just fine. I tell this, I've had her permission, so I'm going to say it. My daughter Catherine, when she was about 5 or 6 years old, Catherine is a sweet soul. And when she was about 5 or 6 years old, I was walking up the steps in our house to the bedrooms, and she was sitting on the chair or on the stairs, crying. You know, small child, 5 or 6 years old, just crying, weeping. Catherine, sweetie, are you okay? Is everything okay? And she said, Daddy, do you remember we were talking about Joseph and doing right and all that? I said, yeah, Bible study, right? She said, well, I'm not. I told a lie. And she was distraught over the fact that where our Bible study had highlighted somebody choosing to do right, she felt convicted as a 5 or 6 year old because she had told a lie to me. Number one, inside, that's a happy dance moment, right? Because she's got at least awareness of her own actions to say, I didn't do, but I need to do. And then she felt bad, and she addressed it. You know, as a dad, I want to affirm the need to make correction, and I just want to wrap her up and hug her, right? Do you think that's how the Lord would feel with people who've turned back to him? Let's leave the ugly behind, wrap you up, and hug. But lest we make that choice, we're not 5 and 6 years old, we're adults. We can reflect on our lives. We can know how we choose to live. And lest we disregard the rescue mission. Verse number 21, there is no peace for the wicked. And our section closes. I give you a final accounting of the topics that in general are presented here in this section. There is no doubt God does not hide the fact that there is accountability. When people do wrong, you know, our sin will find us out. But there's also an affirmation of love. There's no joy in having to correct, but there is joy in correcting and seeing improvement, and people wrapped up in divine love. I put there this quote from Romans chapter 8, all things working together for good, because I believe that in the full application of that verse, everything that God is doing is what the all things are. And everything that he's arranged, that Godhead has put in motion and executed to its fullness, is intended for humanity's benefit. All of these things, what the Father has done, the Son has done, the Spirit has done, is intended to open the doors of blessing to us when we need to be rescued and welcome blessings. This section talks about those things. There is the obvious appeal for righteous living, but there's a great celebration for being able to be God's people. I want to make sure that I take advantage of this rescue plan. It would be the worst thing to think that I would stand before the Lord and for him to be able to say, Isaiah talked about it in advance. People have spoken about it in our own time. You've heard these things. Didn't they impress you? Were they not significant enough to listen and embrace? And I would stand there on that moment and have absolutely zero excuse. because our God has enacted a rescue plan to open the door to life. We just have to say yes. The book of the servant and the story of salvation.